Right, so welcome all to the third video of this week. So far in the first video I just outlined the different views in terms of the three A theory views, according to which there is some truth to the idea that time flows, or the metaphors that we find apt, and the B theory view, which I've mentioned but we're not really going to be talking about too much in detail, but that's as I said, we'll come back to that view later on. And that's the view that there is no truth to the flow of time, and all there is to the universe is just the past, the present, and the future all exist, and they are laid out in terms of B relations, and the apparent movement of time is just an illusion, something like that. So we're sticking with these metaphysical A theory views. In the second video I looked at the moving spotlight view and outlined some of the historical objections to it due to C.D. Broad. In particular, the two objections were the hypertime objection and the rate objection. So now we're going to move to the growing block view, the second of our views, and let's bring it up. So again, it was C.D. Broad, so there's C.D. Broad again, who defended this view first. He rejects the moving spotlight view on the basis of those objections that I've already outlined, and instead defends what he calls a pure becoming view. So we're going to have to think a little bit more about what this pure becoming amounts to. Broad doesn't say very much about it, aside from the fact that he says here pure becoming is very different from any other type of change. We probably really shouldn't, because normally a change involves an object having one set of properties and then changing it to another set of properties. Here, the type of change that he's talking about, he thinks is significantly different. It involves the coming into being, the pure becoming of states of affairs, and he thinks that that's importantly different. He doesn't really spell it out in any more detail than that, but later on we're going to so this is Peter Forrest. He's a contemporary defender of the growing block view, and I think he's got something more interesting to say about pure becoming and what it amounts to, and why it seems to be different from, I suppose, what we might think of as changes on like the B theory view, according to which a change is just an object at one temporal point having one property and an object at another temporal point having another property. That's the kind of change that's what Bertrand Russell thought change was, if you remember, and it was the type of change that McTaggart rejected in the end as not being a true change. He wants to say true changes involve changes in events in terms of their A properties. So okay, we're not going to be talking about that again, but Peter Forrest has got, taking on this C.D. Broad's idea that pure becoming is a different kind of change in some sense. We'll be looking at what he says. In particular, we're looking at what he says in response to some objections that have been put to the growing block view. But before we come to those, let's think about reasons for believing the growing block view. So remember, on this view, the past doesn't exist. Sorry, the future doesn't exist, but the past and the present do. And we're located on the edge of the growing block, and the passage of time is the coming into existence of new states of affairs. And we've got the same general reasons for believing it as the moving spotlight view. So those were, if you remember, that it accounts for our experience of the flow of time. Why does it seem to us? Have I got this up on a separate thing? No, okay. I'll just recap. Why does it seem to us that the future start again. Why does it seem to us that time flows? Why do our experiences have this dynamic quality? Answer, well, because that's what the universe is really like. Time really does flow in some sense, in the sense of new states of affairs come into existence on this view, and also it explains the direction of time from the past to the future, the same as the moving spotlight view did. But perhaps it's got an extra advantage as well, and this is, as I mentioned, the future is open but the past is fixed. I mentioned this in the introductory video. We do seem to have these intuitions, and we'll be looking in a few weeks' time at what that really amounts to. We'll be specifically focusing on this idea that the future is open but the past is fixed, and seeing what sense we can make of that. But at least prima facie, on the surface, it looks as though the growing block view can explain that. Well, the past is fixed because it's there. It exists. It's sort of stuck, as it were, in the way it was. The future is open because it doesn't exist yet. It's yet to come into existence. Okay, so that's the idea. Now, it's a bit odd that C.D. Broad rejects the moving spotlight view on the basis of the hypertime objection and the rate objection, because it seems to me that both of those objections are also going to apply to the growing block view. Of course, I'm not sure that those objections are successful objections. I think that they can reply to them. They can take the replies that we've already given to the hypertime and the rate objection, right? So they can say, sure, well, okay, we're committed to a hypertime. That's fine. That might just be the way reality is. And they can reply to the rate objection by saying, well, it's simple. Time flows at 1 second per second. So they can take both of those replies. So it's not that I think that the growing block view fails, but I don't think the moving spotlight view fails. So the point is, C.D. Broad thought the moving spotlight view failed, and then adopted the growing block view. So it's not clear to me why he thought. He must have thought that the objections that apply to the moving spotlight view don't apply to the growing block view. And I'll just give why I think this is the case. But again, right, we can use the same sorts of considerations. So suppose I draw, so the past exists here, this is up to the present moment in 1900. Well, again, right, I can't draw in one picture, I can't draw the changes going on, because as soon as I do that, I've got a different, now it's 1901, where I can't do it like this. Instead, what I've got to do is to do something like this, draw a series of these 1901 with slightly longer 1902, slightly longer sort of bits in each case, and these are going to represent the universe over time. Put that in there, and then we're going to have this hypertime in place to represent, the universe went from being like this to being like this to being like this to being like this to being like this until we get to the present day, right, which will be a much longer line. I'll just draw that one in, whoop, with 2020, right. It looks again that I'm going to have to appeal to the notion of hypertime to explain how it can be that time flows, how it can be that we get this sort of change in the entire state of the universe. I think C.D. Broad's idea is that there's something about the idea of pure becoming opposed to like a moving spotlight moving across an already existing timeline that makes a difference here. But I'm not clear what it is. It does look to me like we've still got to appeal to hypertime. So anyway, I'll leave that with you. Maybe you can see why perhaps it doesn't apply to the growing block view when it does apply to the moving spotlight view. I can't see it myself, but maybe there is some reason that I'm missing. So anyway, there's that, and similarly for the rate objection. By the way, the one thing I would like to also point out here is this. So let's clear the canvas. I'm drawing these timelines, but let's think about things in time now. So I will just have two of these timelines. One, let's say, taking us up to 2019, and then the second one, so this is the universe in two different states. So we're imagining, these are two different hypertimes, hypertime 1 and hypertime 2 for our purposes. And here now, let's suppose we've got, so this is a person, and suppose that this person loses their hair, let's say, I don't know, between 2019 and 2020, maybe they shave the head or something. So okay, they go from being hirsute to being bald. Now, okay, the point here is, if we think about what happens between this point of the universe and this point, it's not like the object that exists in 2019 goes out of existence. 2019 is still represented here on the timeline, and the person is still there, right, in exactly the same way. That is to say, once this extra bit comes into existence, oh, they also appear to have lost their mouth. I'll put the mouth in. when this extra bit of the universe comes into existence as time flows from 2019 to 2020, nothing here changes. So all of this, the block of the universe up until 2019, remains exactly the same, fixed with all the objects that were in it before. So, going back to, we'll go back to 55 AD, because a lot of the examples include Caesar crossing the Rubicon. So here's Caesar with the sword, I suppose, crossing the Rubicon. So Caesar existed in 2019 in the back of the block in 55 AD, and nothing changes in the back of the block in 2020. So when we get to 2020, all of the past still exists in exactly the same state as it existed before, right? Including the people who have now changed in this time, but also the things that have got long gone out of existence even in 2019. The back block, as it were, doesn't change. It's just that it gains new parts, so it gains like extra bits. Okay, so I just wanted to sort of make that clear about how this growing block view is supposed to work. New bits get added on as the block grows, but the old bits remain the same. Okay, hopefully that's clear enough. So yeah, we're going to come back to that observation shortly. Okay, so at any rate, all I've said so far is, here's a growing block view, here's reasons for believing it. The same reasons as applied with the moving spotlight, but perhaps an extra advantage about the open future. It seems to me that it's open to the same objections as we're open to the moving spotlight view, but it's okay. It can give the same replies and the same responses that the moving spotlighters can give to those objections. Now, in modern times then, although there haven't really been any more objections put towards the moving spotlight view because nobody's really defended it until very recently, there are some objections arising, which perhaps I'll mention in the seminar. There have been objections put to the growing block view. So, as I've just pointed out, Peter Forrest is a modern day defender of the growing block view, and he's got other adherents as well. So the growing block view has been much more popular in recent times than the moving spotlight view, and that means that people have formulated objections to it. And one of the major objections, or really the major objection to the growing block view of recent times, is one given by this chap. This is Craig Bourne, so a philosopher of time, works almost exclusively on the philosophy of time. But Craig Bourne has given what gets called the epistemic objection. The idea, how can we know that it's now? I'll go into some detail and explain this. Alright, so I'll go to this objection in a minute, but I want to point out that there is a related objection to this, which I call the no explanation objection. This is Nicholas J.J. Smith, another philosopher of time, and it isn't exactly the objection that he gives to the growing block. He gives it in a slightly different form, but nonetheless, it's gleaned from Smith. So I think you can get this idea out of it, and it's like, it's this. It undercuts the reason for believing. So one of the reasons we've got for believing the growing block, one of the main reasons, is that it explains our experience of the flow of time. Right? Why is it? I mean, I've just mentioned it. Why is it that we experience time as flowing? Growing block view? Well, because it really does in some sense. But actually, if we pay attention to the previous objection, the epistemic objection, which I'll outline in more detail in a minute, then in fact it not only creates a problem in itself, but it undercuts the reason for believing the growing block view. So the idea is the growing block view can't give an explanation for why it seems to us that time flows. It can't give an explanation of our experiences, hence the no explanation objection. So yeah, these two objections, the no explanation objection and the epistemic objection, I think are related, and I'll try and explain them now. The other point which I'll try to make clear in the explanation of these objections is that although these objections have been formulated against the growing block view, I do think they also apply to the moving spotlight view as well. Alright, So let's turn to the board and see if I can explain them. Here's then the difficulty. Let us suppose then that we have the universe as it currently is according to the growing block view. So 2020, it's where we are, so I'll just put myself, Ben, I suppose I wear glasses, I'll put those on, not exactly accurate. So anyway, it doesn't matter. Here I am in 2020 giving this lecture, and yeah, so I'm here at the edge of the growing block, and yeah, and the idea is meant to be, well, okay, I know that I'm present because I know that I'm at the edge of the growing block, right? I know it is now. So, as it were, now, what do we, okay, I'm going to have to explain this. It seems that if we have to admit that there is this sort of hypertime, now refers both to this edge of the block and also to the point in hypertime that we're up to. So imagine we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and the idea is, well, this is the last hypertime at the moment, we're not yet, so as this block grows, then that will be the addition, that will be down at the next hypertime. Something like this. It's not entirely clear how we are supposed to think about this, but that's the kind of idea. Anyway, this will make it clear. Okay, I now think that I'm located. It might be better to put it like this. Okay, I'm going to put it slightly differently to how Bourne puts it, because we don't need to invoke hypertime for that. How do I know that I am at the edge of the growing block? Because that's what it is to be in the present moment. It's to be at the edge of the growing block, and I now think it is present because I think I'm at the edge of the growing block, right? I mean, I think it's present, and that's what it is to be present. But consider, let's go back to 55 AD again, when we've got Caesar crossing the Rubicon. Here he is. Okay. Now, the point is, remember from what I just said, that the block doesn't change as it grows. So, at some point in the past, the block looked like this, 55 AD, and at that point, when Caesar was there crossing the Rubicon, right, in 55 AD, Caesar thought, I mean, he might not have thought this, but I am present, I'm in the present moment, which would translate, he could have thought, I am at the edge of the growing block, right? He could have thought that, and he would have been right, okay? But suppose he did think this, I'm at the edge of the growing block, well, because nothing changes as the block grows, then if he's there in 55 AD, in the back block, in the past which still exists, there he is thinking, I am at the edge of the growing block. As it were, in some sense, he's thinking that even now. If we look back into the back of the block, because the past still exists, because it's still there, there is Caesar back in 55 AD, and because Caesar, we're supposing, thought I'm at the edge of the growing block when 55 AD was present, well, nothing changes in the back of the block, so Caesar is still there right now, and he's still thinking I am at the edge of the growing block. And indeed, all of Caesar's experiences are as they always have been, except Caesar is wrong. He's not at the edge of the growing block. Oops. He's in the back of the block. Right. In other words, nothing that Caesar, nothing changes about Caesar as time continues on. So if he's still there, nothing's changed about him. He's got exactly the same evidence for believing that he's in the present moment as he had at the point when he was at the edge of the growing block. It's just now he's wrong, right? He's not at the edge of the growing block. He's not in the present moment. So here's the point. We now think, so I now think, I am at the edge of the growing block. right? But the point is, how do I know that I'm right? How do I know that in fact, so let's just get rid of that. Let's just draw in another timeline here. How do I know that I'm not in kind of like the similar situation to Caesar? Let's suppose 2100. So, you know, perhaps time has moved on. This is me again. I'm just trying to draw myself in. I am at the edge of the growing block. So if I think that, I'm wrong. So how can I be confident that I really am at the edge of the growing block in the present moment? I mean, Caesar thinks he's at the edge of the growing block and he's wrong. So what evidence do I have that I'm not in the same situation as Caesar? How do I know that time hasn't flowed on, the block has grown bigger, but I'm here now, stuck in the back block, thinking that I'm in the present moment, but I'm not? There we go. That's the objection. That's the epistemic objection. Epistemic because it's to do with how we know, right? Epistemic means to do with epistemology, how we know things. Hopefully that makes sense, that objection, right? It does seem there's something odd here. For all we know, the future is already happened, as it were. The block has grown. Maybe it's at the year 5000 for all we know, and we're actually in the back of the block, thinking that we're present, when in fact we're in the same situation as Caesar is, thinking that he's present, but in fact is not. Okay, there's the problem. And by the way, the problem. So that's the epistemic problem. How do we know this? But I think we can extend that further. So this is the no explanation objection, and gleaned from Nicholas J.J. Smith, but it's not exactly what he says. It's my take, or adapting what he says a bit. The idea is meant to be, well, look, we can think about it like this. To Caesar in the back of the block, it seems to Caesar that time is flowing, right? It seems to him that things are that time is flowing, and it must seem to him that time is flowing, so goes the thought, because nothing changes. Caesar is in the same intrinsic state as he was when he was at the edge of the block, even though he's now in the back block, because as the block grows, nothing changes in the back block, so Caesar's in the same state as he was, and so therefore, because it seemed to him that time was flowing when 55 AD was present, it must seem that time is flowing to him now, except, okay, so we can put it like this. Time flows for Caesar, where we're thinking about his experience. Time flows for Caesar, right? And in fact, right, if we are in fact in the back of the block, and the future has already gone on and it's 2100, think about our experience. Time flows. I could put here, time flows for Ben. Okay. But now, remember that one of the reasons that we're supposed to have for believing the growing block view is that we get an explanation for the flow of time in terms of being at the edge of the growing block. That time flows because it's the coming into existence of new states of affairs. That's one of the main reasons we've got for believing. It can explain our experience of time flow. Except, now that we've looked at it like this, it turns out, well, it can't be that being at the edge of the block explains why we have the experience of time flow, because here's Caesar back in 55 AD, and it seems to him that time flows even though he's not at the edge of the block, right? Likewise, if we're wrong about being at the edge of the block, well, it still seems to us that time flows, but it's not because we're at the edge of the block. In other words, therefore, we undercut our reason for thinking that time flows, for thinking that the growing block can explain, in terms of being at the edge of the growing block, the flow of time. So, there are problems here for the growing block view. I hope you can see that. I think it's quite a tricky objection to get your head round, so if you're not sure about it, don't worry too much. We'll talk more about it in the seminar. But I hope it gives that some introduction to this. Now, there are the two objections, and I'm going to now move to Peter Forrest again. So I said he's the modern day defender of the growing block view. He thinks he's got a reply to the epistemic and the no explanation objection, and it's to do with the idea that the edge of the growing block is the point of flux. He talks about the idea of the flux of time, and it's where true causation takes place. So I'm going to try and explain this again, and he calls this the dead past hypothesis. So the idea is, yes, the past is all still there, but it's dead. There is no experiences going on there because it's not at the point of causal flux or friction, people sometimes say. So okay, let's go back to the board again. Here then is the idea. Let's clear it off and just have a single timeline just to make it somewhat clear. Alright, so here we're going to suppose, we're just going to focus on Caesar back in 55 AD. I might have got that date wrong, by the way. I think it's around 55 AD when Caesar crossed the Rubicon. People know what this is, Caesar crossing the Rubicon. It's when Caesar was, just a bit of, I suppose it's worth mentioning just so you've got some idea what this example's about. Not at all important for what we're talking about, but anyway. So yeah, Caesar was a army general at the time, around about this time, and he was commanding armies in Gaul. One of the other major generals, Pompey, was back in Rome, and he banned, because there had been various cases of Roman generals trying to take over Rome by marching their armies, which they were in control of, into Rome itself and taking over the Roman Empire. Caesar was banned from bringing his armies across the Rubicon, which was the border between Gaul and the Roman, the sort of main, the centre of Rome, the Italian Rome. And Caesar, he was ordered to come back to Rome alone. Caesar wasn't having any of this, so Caesar made up his decision, no, I'm going to march my army into Rome and take over. So it was the decisive moment. Caesar crossing the Rubicon was him leading his armies back to Rome to take over Rome, which he did in the end. Anyway, doesn't really matter. But okay, here's Caesar in 55 AD crossing the Rubicon. So far then we've had this idea, well, because nothing changes as the block grows, Caesar is intrinsically the same as he was when he was at the edge of the block, so he can be thinking, I am at the edge of the block, or I am present at the present moment. It's meant to be the same thing. I am at the edge of the block, he might be thinking. Or, you know, he might be thinking time flows, or time is flowing. So he's having these thoughts, so goes the idea, except that he is wrong. Alright. Peter Forrest's reply is to say, no, he's not having any of these thoughts anymore. He's in the same physical state as he was, that is, his brain is in the same kind of configuration and his body is in the same configuration as it was. But the actual going on of consciousness, conscious thought, requires that there is this kind of coming into being. So here we are, so here's me again at the edge of the block, and I right now am having conscious thoughts because of I don't know how to draw it, because of this sort of special zing and zang and zap, the kind of the edge of the block is where things are becoming, they're coming into existence, states of affairs are happening, and that gives rise to consciousness on this view. So the world is more than just physical on this sort of a idea, or rather perhaps it's not more than physical, but it's more than the mere configuration, the mere arrangement of physical particles. To get true causation and causal fission has to be the coming into existence of stuff. So I can have thoughts, time is flowing, right? And indeed I am having these thoughts because the edge of the block, I'm coming into existence, all these thoughts are coming into existence. As soon as the time goes on, change back to black, to here, at that point these thoughts sort of disappear. The things that used to exist are still there in the past and represented, and there's a kind of record of the past, but the thoughts go. The thoughts only occur as the causal friction is going on. That's the idea that Peter Forrest has. So that's to say the past is dead. Caesar is there in the back of the block, his physical configuration is sort of still there, fixed for all time. but the thoughts that Caesar had have ceased to exist, right? The brain states that gave rise to those thoughts perhaps exist, but the thoughts themselves have now gone. So, how can I know that I'm in the present moment? Well, it's a kind of a proof by introspection, the same kind of proof that Descartes had, that he exists, right? I am thinking, therefore I am now, we might put it, right? That sort of a line of thought. Because we can introspect and know that we're having conscious thoughts, we can know that we're at the edge of the block. Caesar, well, there are no conscious thoughts. He doesn't think he's at the edge of the block at the moment. His thoughts have died away, so there's no problem. We don't have to consider the fact that Caesar is thinking these things and he's wrong. He doesn't think them at all. We are thinking them, and that's how we know we're at the edge of the block. That's Forrest's reply. So, interesting, I think. Notice, by the way, that all this that we've been talking about, actually, before I come to that, I think there's a further problem with all of this, which I'm going to leave for the time being, but I'll signal it now. So I'll come back to this next week. There are problems with what we might call truth. So in other words, there's Peter Forrest's reply, but I think there's a further response to Forrest's reply which involves the notion of truth makers, and which shows that in fact there's still problems here that the grown block view has got to take account of. But I'm going to leave that for now. I'm going to come back to this idea of truth makers, because next week we're going to be talking about one of the most famous objections in the philosophy of time. It's specifically to presentism. I'm going to introduce it in the next little video, short video, but we're going to look at it in more detail next week, and it's called the truth maker objection. So we'll be coming back to that. Alright, so what I wanted to say as well is all of these things that we've just been talking about then, damn, I meant to say this as well. This also, it doesn't only solve the epistemic objection, it solves the idea that time flows again, right? It does. This is meant to be a reply to the no explanation objection as well, because it explains why it seems to us that time flows. That's a psychological thing. It seems to us that time is flowing because we're on the edge of the block, and that's where the causal friction takes place, and that's where thought comes from. There's Caesar in the back of the block. It doesn't seem to him that time is flowing because, right, he doesn't have any thoughts. It's the dead past. He's just locked there physically in the back of the block, but no longer having thoughts. Okay. And yeah, finally then, the thing I wanted to say was all of this that we've just been talking about seems perfectly well to apply to the moving spotlight view as well. So we can make exactly the same point. Here is me again. Let's have me. Right. And Caesar, 55 AD. So this is the situation we think it is. We think the red dot representing the present. We think that we're in the present moment. But, you know, how do we know that the present moment is located where we are? Caesar thinks it's located where he is. You can see the idea. The same problems are going to arise. The epistemic objection is still going to apply. And I suppose you could reply in the same way as Peter Forrest does and think that, in fact, where the dot is what causes the causal friction, so you can give the same reply. So, you know, the same objection that applies here to the growing block view also applies to the moving spotlight view, and the same replies, it seems, are available again, unless there's something special about pure becoming. And again, maybe there is, but I can't really see what that's supposed to be, but maybe you can. Alright, so there we go. I think that's all I'm going to say in this video. Yeah, so that's actually, those are left over from that's from the previous video. Yes, so just to recap though where we've got to. So far we've had a look at the we're focusing in on the A theory. We've considered the moving spotlight view and some historical objections which also apply to the growing block view and the replies to them. We've now considered the growing block view and some more modern objections which were formulated specifically against the growing block view, but which actually also apply to the moving spotlight view as well. And we've had a look at the replies to those. So in the next video it's only going to be very brief. I'm going to talk about presentism a little bit, a few things to say about it, but then we're going to focus in on those problems next week when we talk about presentism and the famous truth maker objection. So if you like, although these lectures have been called the A theory and the B theory lectures, what we're really doing is considering just a couple of the A theory views in detail: the moving spotlight view, the growing block view, and looking at objections to them and responses. And the other A theory and B theory views, so B theory eternalism as it's called, are going to be dealt with in later weeks. So you'll see, if you just keep up with these lectures, then things will make perfect sense as we go. Alright, thanks. So the last little video then, introducing the issues to do with presentism.